So it looks like for the most part, we've got everyone in here. I'm sure people will still continue to filter in, but hello everyone. I'm Tony. I'm the trap support specialist with Pig Brig. We've got a great webinar for y'all today, and we're hoping to have a little bit of time at the end for some questions and answers. So if y'all do end up with any questions during this webinar, feel free to place them in the Q&A widget that is at the bottom of the screen, and we'll see how many of those questions we can get to at the end. And this webinar is being recorded, and we're hoping to have it for y'all here in the next coming weeks. So keep an eye on your email for whenever that comes through. But Michaela, you've got the floor.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Michaela Killam. I am on the Business and Conservation Initiatives team at Pig Brig. And today our guest speaker is going to be David Bergman. He is the state director in Arizona for USDA. If you're not familiar with your acronyms, that's the United States Department of Agriculture, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services for Wildlife Services in Arizona. He has a lot of experience with wild pig management. He serves on different organizations around the country and internationally, and he has been kind enough to give us some time today to share some of his experience, where we're going to be talking about the Havasu National Wildlife Refuge. So with that, Dave, I'll let you take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Michaela. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the kind introduction. Let me get the presentation shared here. But what I'd like to talk to you today about is federal collaboration through feral swine eradication, which for us has been a success story as we enhance biodiversity here in Arizona. Just quick little background on myself. As Michaela said, I've got a fair amount of experience in the feral swine world. I actually have 36 years experience with wildlife services, and I've been leading a group for development of an international feral swine management plan with Canada, Mexico, and the US for about 5 years now. So our story has a long history. It goes back actually to the Coronado expedition in the 1540 to 1542. For those that are history buffs, Coronado, Spanish conqueror, came over to Mexico, and he was looking for the cities of gold, ended up in Quivira in Kansas. Well, a part of that route was through the Southwest, especially Arizona and New Mexico. At that time, when the Spanish conquerors, the conquistadors were here, they brought with them three key animals. One was the horse for transport. One was the dog, a utilitarian dog, and it was used as a guard dog, attack dog. And the other one was swine, domestic swine. Well, they primarily used swine because swine were easy to keep. They could eat almost anything on the landscape, and they produced quite well throughout the year, multiple times throughout the year. So it was a low maintenance. And so as these conquering armies went across North America, they traveled with free roaming herded swine. So that'd be the first introduction within Arizona as we look at domestic swine escapes. So as they're going across Arizona, you can just imagine that you had these domestic pigs were either being chased off by the Native Americans, something new and unique to them, possibly eaten by other groups, as well as just wandering off by themselves. So that was our first introduction to swine within the state. Our second influx of swine came a couple hundred years later, 100 to 200 years later, and the key individual in that was Father Kino. Father Kino, a Jesuit, set up a series of missions in the Southwest, and the goal was set up 20 different missions. And once he established these missions with either priests or friars or different people in the ministry, as well as the goal was converting the Native Americans in the area and providing services to the Spanish and the Mexican folks that were in the area. part of the setup within these missions was to ensure they had a food source, trying to grow their own crops. But they also established two main food sources. One was domestic swine, and the other one was chickens. Both of them are very easy to raise, just like with the conquistadors. They're self-sufficient in many ways as far as finding their own feed and taking care of themselves. But as within the conquistadors, they weren't really kept in a very good pen system. Quite often they wandered off, or in many cases, the local Native Americans would drive them off either to eat or just to eliminate the resources for the missions. So that was our second influx of swine into the state. But those influxes continued into the 1700s. The two main ones that are probably the most influential with bringing swines would be Francisco Garces in 1774 along the Colorado River and the Dominguez Escalante expedition that went across northern Arizona. Both of those would have had domestic swine with them as well as a primary food source. And we run into, again, escapes and movements across the state. So by the 1880s, we're moving through history pretty fast here. We didn't have a lot of pigs reported in the state, but we did have hundreds reported by the New York Times along the Colorado River, primarily from Needles, California, which would be Fort Mojave, Arizona, down south to Yuma and south to San Luis into Mexico. So we have a number, and as many of you know, a real key to the swine is a water source, a regular water source for them on a daily basis. So the advantage we have in Arizona that some of you may not have is we have limited water sources. And I think that has truly been a reason that we haven't had the populations that you see in Texas and California, and even previously some of the populations you saw in some areas in New Mexico, is due to the limited water sources. But as you can see, our biggest population was on the Colorado River, and so that was our biggest source. Here we have water year-round, readily available, and food sources for them as well. So talking to the Fish and Wildlife Service in the early 2000s, we started to put some documents together in the hopes that the stars would align. We could start actually manning feral swine on the refuge. The service firmly believed that the populations that were identified by the New York Times in the 1880s were the sources of their feral swine on the refuge itself. We had a few other instances of swine within the state. If you look at some of the early promotional issues for Arizona, trying to encourage people to come here, establish themselves, create a farming cultural adaptation. A lot of places within Arizona that have sources of water, especially along the Colorado River. We see it in southeast Arizona, along the San Pedro River. We see it along the Salt River, and some of the other rivers here in the state was the growth of alfalfa, to feed horses and cattle and other livestock. But at the same time, they promoted not only growing alfalfa, but this was a great, you might say, a dual farm industry, dual crop industry. You farm alfalfa and then you raise pigs on top of that. And so many of these fields were not fenced in well, so we had a number of escapes during this time period as well. Pig promotion, surprisingly, in the desert Southwest was pretty common. Trying to feed the population coming here, but not only the population here, but the population across the U.S. adding into that population. We had high years of 60,000 pigs in Arizona. Many of these were farmed. Some of them were free grazing or free range almost, because the fences weren't very good to hold them in. And so we have different populations popping up throughout the hundreds of years history we have here in the Southwest dealing with pigs itself. But all that started to change with the National Wildlife Refuge System. In 1941, Roosevelt created Havasu National Wildlife Refuge. It's on the Colorado River, and it's one of the key refuges in the nation here. Havasu is primarily a refuge that borders both sides of the Colorado River from Needles on down to Lake Havasu City. It's got land in a little bit in California, most of it's in Arizona, but it's a 37,515 acre refuge. Where the river's not flowing strongly, you find a lot of cattail marshes, strongly choked by cattails. And then when you get outside of that, you have real rough country, the mountains there, and there's a wilderness area that surrounds a part of that. And in that wilderness area, you can find bighorn sheep as well. The other problem animal we have on the refuge occasionally would be burros as well. But this refuge is very popular with the public in America in that it gets 3 million plus visitors on an annual basis. So the goal is to restore the refuge to pristine, remove the invasive species, of which feral swine was the number one issue they wanted to remove. And in fact, if you go to some of the local restaurants, you'll see different pictures of feral swine that were identified on the river hanging in the different restaurants. It was somewhat of a tourist attraction at one point. Here's the actual map of Havasu National Wildlife Refuge. You have Topok Marsh in the north, close to Needles. Needles is on Interstate 40 that goes through. Bullhead City is just north of that in Arizona, and Laughlin, Nevada is close by as well. So the main part of the refuge on the north side, and we kind of divide the refuge in half for management purposes. You have the north side, which is different wetlands that are actually flooded by the service for waterfowl, migratory waterfowl in the fall and winter, and it's targeted for rest areas for those waterfowl as well as hunting waterfowl during the hunting season in fall and winter. The next part is below Interstate 40, and that is where we find the wilderness area, the bighorn sheep country, and quite honestly, it is a huge tourist attraction to the spring breakers. So coming up here soon in March, it will be flooded with spring breakers, big, powerful, what in Florida they call the big cigar boats running up and down the river, and lots of boats tied together turning into party barges. So it's a colorful area. It's an entertaining area to work, but we do have a mission there to remove the feral swine. So moving on, after the development of the refuge itself, pigs were still pretty popular in the state. Arizona only has 15 counties in the state. We're a very large state. We're about the 5th largest state in the nation, landmass wise, but we have very large counties. Most of the counties in the state did have at some point a domestic hog production. We only have one county left, Navajo County, which is one of the long counties up in the top right that still has domestic swine production. The rest of the swine production in the state has pretty much gone away, except for 4-H pigs and live bear pigs. But there is a domestic facility in Navajo County, which has some issues for us as well. But the refuge, due to all the feral pigs on the refuge, they decided in 1975 that they would try and manage the pigs themselves. And they wanted to do this by providing an opportunity for the local hunters at a time. So they set up a draw system for the hunters, and they brought in 25 hunters at a time. So 7 different periods to have 175 hunters come through and try and remove swine on the refuge. They only removed 42 pigs in those 7 different hunting bouts. So the Fish and Wildlife Service deemed this a failure. One is they didn't remove enough pigs for what they needed to manage. 2, it was extremely costly in funding as well as personnel needed to manage the hunt. So they canceled all future hunts. So hunting wasn't allowed on the refuge except for that one time. And any other pigs, and you'll hear a lot of stories from locals, especially the more senior locals, about pigs that were taken off the refuge. And these were pigs that were people would sneak on the refuge and remove illegally. Well, there was a little work done with the pigs in looking at disease work. It really didn't impact the numbers because, as you're aware, pigs can reproduce twice, sometimes in the best conditions 3 times a year. And so with those kind of numbers, they can easily replenish themselves. But the first research study done on pigs was on hog cholera and looking at its impacts. Do we still have it between 79 and 87 in the state? In large areas of the United States, hog cholera was a huge impact to the domestic swine industry, killing off whole populations within a farmer's farmstead. In Arizona, it would kill off a few animals in a herd. It wouldn't necessarily kill off all of them because of the dry conditions. And so the disease acted differently here in the state. So a number of animals were collected from Arizona. They sampled 83 animals at the time, working with the Southeastern Cooperative in Georgia, and to document hog cholera. So that was our first study. But where we really started to get into working with the refuge is when I first showed up here in 2001. That first year, we already had discussions with the refuge about the need to manage feral swine. At that time, neither Wildlife Services nor the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had funding to properly address feral swine. But when our program created our National Wildlife Disease Program, that was our first opportunity to get some funding to start to look at feral swine on the refuge. Granted, we did not get enough money to truly manage the swine, but we did get enough money that we could go in twice a year and take some of the swine. Usually the goal was to try and get up to 25 in each period for a variety of disease studies that were occurring across the country. So Tom DeLiberto, who recently retired in May, was our first director of that program. And he saw the need to look at feral swine across the nation and what diseases and disease issues they were causing. So one of the first studies we did was survey for classical swine fever. This is a foreign animal disease. Luckily, we did not have that in the state or anywhere in the country. But Arizona was one of those first states that we looked at. We did 41 animals in 2007 and 24 in 2008. All those were negative across the country, which was good news for everybody involved. From there, we looked at leptospira in feral swine. This is a zoonotic disease, and so we looked here in Arizona as well, taking samples in multiple years. That study was published in 2014 from samples from 2007 to 2011. We followed that up by trichinella and Toxoplasma gondii. Both of these can be zoonotic, and Arizona, as you can see from the map down in the left corner, that is showing where all the different sampling populations were. Well, of course, most of the sample sizes come from the Southeast, from Texas or from California, but we've managed to just, even with our small populations, participate in these different studies along the way to find out whether we had anything or not. We submitted 40 samples for that study. We did have one sample come up positive for Toxoplasma gondii. So these populations aren't clean, even though they're distinct and separated from populations across the country. We also looked for influenza D virus across the state and participated in that study between 2012 and 2013. But that just told us a little bit about the background of the pigs. Are they healthy? Are they not? What issues do we have to contend with? What issues does the public have to worry about as far as zoonotic diseases and on human health and safety? The original estimate from the 1880s stated that we had hundreds along the Colorado River. Well, Jack Mayer, did an estimate in 2009, and his estimate at the time put Arizona's population between a low of 500 and a high of 1,000. And that was a statewide estimate, not just the Colorado River. We do have other populations, or had other populations in the state up on the Virgin River in northwest Arizona by Mesquite, Nevada. There's a few animals there. We have some down in Cochise County on the San Pedro River, and some near a small town of Bowie that a local producer free ranges that continually escape. And then we also have a high fence operation in Navajo County that had a hunting operation for feral swine on the Little Colorado River. And that population, the high fence was flooded out, was by the Colorado River, and they've had numerous escapes from that population as well. And then over time, we've had a couple other populations, but those are the main populations we're working on here within the state. Other studies we looked at, we participated in a swine brucellosis study of feral swine, so we removed some from Havasu as well between 2009 and 2010. And then we also looked at salmonella and E. coli. We did find that our swine from Havasu were positive for salmonella, which is a huge concern. If you go downstream from Havasu, you get into the #1 lettuce producing area in the United States, with around 70% of the lettuce produced from water from the Colorado River in that country. So there was concern that feral swine could be transmitting diseases to the water that would move downstream and infect our vegetable crops that are grown for the country down there. We also looked at another study for toxoplasma. We did have one positive. It was genotype 5 here in Arizona when we participated in that study. We looked at Neospora caninum in feral swine. And so we had 35 samples there, and we found within that 35 samples, primarily from Havasu, that 31% were positive for Neospora caninum, which is another disease of concern in livestock, especially. The number was revised. Dr. Mayer revised the number in 2014, and that number was revised downward to a low of 200 to a high of 600. I'm not sure we ever had 600 in my time here. We were probably closer to the 200 range across the state and 200 to 400. So our numbers have always been fairly low within the state. But what really helped us out in working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies, Bureau of Land Management, Arizona Game and Fish Department, and other partnerships, was the creation of the National Feral Swine Damage Management Program. That was created in 2014 by an act of Congress providing $20 million in funding. All the states with feral swine were broken into a system of either 0 to 5. 0 were the states with no feral swine. State level 1 are states that our goal is full eradication. And state level 5 would be like Texas, Florida, California, states that we have feral swine. We know that we will probably never eradicate in those states, but we will solve problems for a variety of cooperators in those states. So, as I said, Arizona is a level 1 state. Our goal, uh, not only our goal for USDA Wildlife Services, but it's also the goal for the Arizona Department of Agriculture, Arizona uh, Game and Fish Department, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, the State Land Department, U.S. Forest Service, and a number of other partners, including the Nature Conservancy, is to eradicate feral swine within the state of Arizona. We got a full team working on that right now. I'll mention a couple things in a little bit, but that is where we are headed. And our first real goal was to work with Havasu National Wildlife Refuge and try and clear out the refuge for the service. Their big goal was if they could clear out the refuge, that showed hope for other refuges across the nation, and that would be the first refuge that had feral swine eliminated for it as well. So we decided, now that we have some real funding, we're going to start putting a person at Havasu. We started just with a half time, going there half the year and working other projects just with one individual. And as you probably might surmise, we quickly became aware that only working at Havasu part-time did not accomplish what we needed to, because with feral swine producing piglets 2 to 3 times a year, while we removed a number of pigs, we weren't gaining any traction because we'd have litters produced when we weren't there. So we looked at a number of options, and we decided as we've gone along to throw everything at it we can, and that includes trapping, shooting, snaring, aerial work, Judas pigs, drones, dogs, whatever we could come up with, we have tried at Havasu. So when it first came out, the public, as you might imagine, said, "Oh, why are we paying the government to do this work? We as hunters can solve the problem." Well, hunters didn't solve it in the 70s. Hunters didn't solve it with illegal take over all the years. And so the refuge policy at the time was no hunting for swine on the refuge. The hunting was allowed on the refuge for waterfowl and upland game, but swine was not part of that at that time. So we kept that stance, and I think part of that stance helps us out in that we don't see individuals moving pigs as much to an area that doesn't allow hunting. And don't get me wrong, I'm an active hunter myself. In fact, I've gone to different states to hunt swine myself, and so I understand it. But people's good intentions sometimes and quite often backfire on when they get into moving swine around for other uses. So early on, when we started doing a lot of work there, the public was quite vocal. Sorry about that. And they reached out to Senator John McCain at the time, and they tried to push Senator John McCain to shut us down because they wanted to solve the issue with hunting through some education at the time. And what the public thought there was at least 1,000 swine out there. We've never come close to that, even in all the years we've been working there. But we spent some time with John McCain's office, and we convinced them that, working together in partnership with all the agencies, not just USDA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but state agencies and NGOs and others, that was the right strategy to go forward for elimination of swine at Havasu National Wildlife Refuge. So while we're removing swine and using trapping and snares and firearms, where we really started to make headway is when we started to bring in helicopter. With the resources through our National Feral Swine Management Program, they came up with resources for regional helicopters. So The regional helicopter is actually staged in Texas, and so we looked at bringing the helicopter over. We started with once a year, and we have the time frame on the refuge where we have limited activity. The refuge between March 15th and September 15th is considered a key refuge for endangered species, especially endangered birds, for their breeding seasons. And so a lot of our work was outside of that time frame. So we started with just bringing the helicopter in one time a year outside of that breeding season. And so the first operations, we removed over 60 pigs in a couple of days. And that brought a lot of media and a lot of interest from the local public. But it made a huge dent for us and helped. If you remember one of the early pictures, you saw the cattail choked wetland. There's really only a couple roads in the north. There's really no roads in the south. It's all waterway and cattails. And so we are very limited on where we can get to and what we can get to. Most of those cattails are 10, 12 feet tall or taller. And so it's in some ways almost impossible to work in some of those. Early on, when we started this work and you flew over or you were in those cattails, there was a lot of evidence, a lot of tunnels in those cattails showing where the swine were moving back and forth. And in the mesquite groves out in the upper uplands where the swine were moving, mesquite groves as well as salt cedar. And salt cedar is pretty troublesome to work in as well because it's very thick in those areas as well. So you can see where the swines were moving. That helped us to set up where we're going to put camera traps and trap lines and snares and traps. But um, we we were moving forward. Helicopter made a big difference. The first 5 years, you look at the resources we're protecting in Arizona. Havasu is a big part of that. Granted, we're working across the state to protect agriculture, human health and safety, natural resources, and property. But early on, we really only had the three tools, ground shooting, trapping, and aerial. But our tools expanded with time beyond our first 5 years of the program with the National Feral Swine Program. Our work at Havasu National Wildlife Refuge, why there is some agriculture to the north and south of the refuge, we're really there to protect natural resources. As I mentioned, there is a number of species there that are endangered, and habitats that they want to manage as well that the feral swine were either threatening, damaging, or destroying. One of the interesting things with every pig that we remove that we can get hands on, we always try and get multiple uses out of that swine. One is to solve a problem and either help a farmer, help a rancher, help a natural resource organization or agency to protect the natural resources or protect property for a private individual. But when we remove these swine, we want to collect as much information on them as we can. I mentioned a number of the studies we collected information on. We are still collecting samples. All those samples are either tested for a current study. If they're not tested, they are archived at our archive center in Fort Collins at our National Wildlife Research Center headquarters. We have a new archive system there. They had the grand opening for that this last summer. And so if there's individuals on here that are interested in studies from either your local area, regional, or national, you can partner with the National Wildlife Research Center to access the archives for samples we have from all across the nation for future studies that you may be interested in to look at different diseases. With SARS-CoV-2 here recently, that was one of the things the archive was tapped for, looking at SARS-CoV-2 and a number of mammal species. Was it out there circulating before it really hit the public? And so there's a lot of different uses for that archive. The other big use of that archive is we send in genetic material for genetic studies across the nation. And not only it helps us learn what's going on, what kind of populations we're dealing with. Are they that fair swine mix? Is it mostly from domestic animals, domestic escapes? Is it, traced back to wild boar, Russian imports? And what's the mix? Most of the pigs in the U.S. are an ad mix. If you look at the right side of your screen, you'll see there's a lot of mix in there from domestic swine to wild boar. But what's unique is here in Arizona, you see a solid blue on the state. Our feral swine are almost 100% domestic heritage breed of swine. So that's where our backing is. We've had some changes with time with some recent imports. The other thing that the genetic testing provides for us is we have such a large database now that we can get a sample, say a sample shows up in Wyoming where we don't have feral swine. We can go to the archives now and say, where did this pig come from? Can we trace it to a feral swine sample from another state to look at illegal movements of swine across the states? And in fact, some of this does help with enforcement cases across the country. Looking at it a little bit further in depth, there's been a couple studies now looking at genetics of swine, looking at the archive samples we have in Fort Collins. We've been a big part of that study all along. But again, most of our breeds are Western heritage breeds, those domestic swine that are grown for the domestic food industry. We've had a very, very small portion of European wild boar. We suspect we've had one or two samples from Havasu come up, European wild boar, and we suspect those had moved there from populations within California. So the refuge, working with a number of partners, ourselves, the different universities and stuff, are constantly promoting the need to eradicate within the state, get rid of feral swine. By the early 2020s, we've removed hundreds of swine from the refuge. A lot of those were with helicopter. There's going to be a link put in the chat. We, as part of our outreach, trying to educate everybody on what's going on as far as management purposes, but the need to eradicate feral swine. Wildlife Services has put together a series called Feral Swine in America. Episode number 4 was on our work at Havasu National Wildlife Refuge. I encourage you, when you have the time, to watch that video. It will give you a little bit different perspective because you'll see the aerial view and you'll see what we're up against while we've been working there. And it talks about some of our tools there. So things changed. In about 2020, the first Trump administration wanted to have more activities on public lands, especially refuges, where they could have more consumptive users, recreational users using these lands for hunting, trapping, and other resources. So at the time, Secretary Bernhardt reached out to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and said, I need a list of all the refuges and how we're going to expand those uses on the refuge. So that was where we changed what we were doing on the refuge. We had made a huge dent in the refuge. The population has really gone down. We didn't have many pigs left, but due to the Trump administration, the refuge was added back in as a refuge that if you are out there hunting for waterfowl or upland game and you see a feral swine, you're allowed to take it during those hunting seasons. Not outside the hunting season, it had to be part of a regulated hunting season. But one of the newest tools that's really helped us a lot is eDNA, environmental DNA. And that's where we go sample the water. We take a sample out of the water column. We send that to Fort Collins, and that sample can tell us within a few weeks if there were feral swine in that area. And so that helps us to manage our resources. Our, we had camera traps, but camera traps are limited. Water sample gives you a better sample because we know that either the pig's going to drink in the water, wallow in the water, walk through it, even swim in it. We've seen a number of pigs swimming in the water out there that leaves traces of environmental DNA, and that can tell us where the pigs are. So we look at 20 to 30 samples on a regular basis. We just did another 20 some samples here about a week ago. We're waiting for those results to see if we have any positive hits for feral swine. And what we use those tools for is we know that, bringing the helicopter here is not cheap. It is an expensive tool, but it's a very, very effective tool. But we try and use these other tools to direct it. And so a good example of how this worked is we got a number of hits. If you look at the red dots, those would be hits with the eDNA. And so what we do is during our helicopter removal operations, now we're doing one session in September and one session in February. So we got another one coming up here in February. We take the eDNA, we look at the results. If we got some positives right before the helicopter gets here, we take a drone out with infrared and we look to see if we can find further evidence, try and pick up on the swine. And then using that, the eDNA evidence and the drone work, we can direct the helicopter to those the most highly likely sites where we have evidence to spend government resources in the most efficacious way that we can at those locations, and not spend time just flying up and down looking for something. We want to do targeted removal, and so we try and partner all the tools together. A drone has really helped us out. This is Mark Lutman. Mark Lutman was with our feral swine program. He is now our national coordinator for drones. And so he implemented the drone out there. We're adding drones throughout Arizona. Now we have 2 pilots here in Arizona, and we're adding additional drones. The other tool, it's probably considered an old tool, but it's one that's been very effective for us as well, is not only do we use camera and eDNA, track counts, our other tools, the drone, but we use dogs. We bring in a team from our program in Texas, and we're running those through areas as well, looking for swine, either for them to remove or to help in our helicopter operations. So we're trying everything we can to remove animals here. And in addition to that, the service has been able to find funding to use habitat management. So we have these large choke cattail areas. They've gone in and found funding to burn off a lot of these old choke cattail areas. So the habitat comes in new and clean. We get rid of all the old tunnels, all the old swine sleeping and nesting areas, and we can find out if we have a new incursion, just because we can manage and get through that habitat a lot easier. It helps with people movement. It helps with dog movement as well. It helps with the drone because you don't have such a thick canopy that you're trying to see through too. So looking at our feral swine removal, if we go back to 2006 when we started keeping track, taking swine for our national disease program, we had numbers every year, usually less than 60. We were going twice a year with our disease program. And so we've had some ups and downs. When you get to 2017, that's when we started 16, 17, bringing in the helicopter. And you can see with those helicopter removals, and I'm not sure why all the lines aren't showing up there, but we'll just go with the annual line. Our peak there in the annual lines primarily due to the helicopter removal. We had those big points with the helicopter, and so dropping down to 2022, we're still removing with the helicopter. And by the time we got to 2024, we haven't removed any feral swine in 2024 from the refuge itself. Looking at our tools that we use trapping, firearms, helicopters, and neck stairs to remove them. This is just another way of looking at that annual take. We see early on, pretty much stable numbers, usually less than 40 per year that we're removing with the different tools for disease sampling, bringing in the helicopter after 2014, primarily 2017 is when we started, 65 the first time, 96, 32, 33. And then our numbers dropped to 5 and 1 in 22, 0 in 23, and 0 or 1 in 24. So we're getting there. We think we're at the end. We're hoping we're at the end. And if we look at what we've submitted for sampling, for testing and the different samples, we pretty much had uniform sample. We're not trying to get equal samples. We're submitting just based on what we're collecting in the population. So it was pretty much equal sampling between male and female, more or less throughout the years. But the last few we removed have been males that we've been able to get to. And so that's what we think we're down to, is just probably less than 5 out there. Like I said, we're waiting for the eDNA results. The last eDNA said they suspected there were still some pigs there last fall. We brought the helicopter and all the teams in. We weren't able to find anything. So we're going to try that again, but we are probably close to calling Havasu clean of feral swine, and that's our goal. One of the big positives that we have seen on the removal there, as I said, the refuge is not only a refuge for waterfowl and waterfowl hunting activities, but it's also key to endangered species. And with the removal of the feral swine, we've seen the northern Mexican garter snake recovery on the refuge. When the swine were active and we had a lost swine, there was never a sighting of the garter snake. But since the swine have been removed, we're seeing that garter snake come back now. And we think a lot of that's due to the removing the predatory swine. But we do have new threats. We're always worried about an influx of people moving pigs in, especially now that it's part of the refuge language that they can hunt pigs there. We're always keeping our eyes open, monitoring constantly. But on the north end of the refuge, there is a loosely fit trailer court area. Most of the trailers are on properties of quarter, half acre, 1 acre or larger. And what the threat was there was we had a potbelly population running free there. And so now we've had to go into that trailer court and remove potbelly pigs. We've removed over 30 potbelly pigs already. And so as a program, we treat potbelly pigs as feral swine when they're free ranging as well. And so those are the threats we're concerned with. Is we've done all this work, we've put all this time, effort, and money into this, cleaning out the refuge, showing some success. We'd hate to see somebody with their good intentions ruin that success rate we've had. But again, that's an overview. It's a little bit different than what a lot of you are probably running into. It's kind of a unique case here in Arizona, but it's not that different in that we have to use a lot of the same tools you all are using, but it's really comes down to the partnerships you build to work together to solve all these issues. And I really want to thank Pig Brig for their generosity and include me in this seminar series. And it's been a pleasure working with Pig Brig and their folks there. They're truly good folks and an honor to work with. And that is my overview. And so I see Tony popped up. Back to you, Tony.
Well, thank you so much, David, for your time today and preparing this presentation. It doesn't look like we've got any questions in the Q&A at the moment, and it looks like we're coming pretty close to time. So I think at this time, everyone, the recording it is being recorded, so you should receive that recording probably within the next couple of weeks. So just keep an eye on your email. Even if you weren't able to show up today, you'll get an email. If you're looking for future webinars, be sure to go in and register for those. And once again, thank you, David, for your time. And everyone have a great day.